So, Juliana, I wanted to start with how you got into this. I understand you've been practicing or working in astrology and other sort of related fields for a number of years. What's your backstory? How did you actually come to this?
Well, I'm 39 now, and I started when I was 18, studying astrology. And it was just because I was working and someone brought an astrology book to work, and I started looking up my different planets and what signs they were in and what that meant. And I was really blown away by how accurate it was. And I was pretty skeptical at first, like, how is this so accurate and how is this working? And I kept studying more to try to find the loophole or to understand, how something so, illogical could work so well or seemingly illogical. And so the more I studied and the more I learned, the more accurate it became. And it got to a point pretty quickly where all my friends were calling me every day, like asking me to look at their charts and look at their new crushes charts. And when I went to college, I had lines out the door from people who wanted their charts read in my dorm room. And then I moved to a Buddhist retreat center at one point, and like all of the staff that I worked with and different retreatants who were there in retreat wanted to have their charts read as well. And so it just made me kind of popular and in demand wherever I went. And I was pretty socially awkward before. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and I was always a kind of black sheep and a little bit of a born liberal in a conservative world, and a weirdo, compared to the cheerleaders who I was surrounded by, and arty and different. And I was very perplexed by people and by myself even, and by human relationships. And when I started to study astrology, I realized it was this beautiful system that kind of showed me the layers of human complexity in a very logical, organized way, And so whether you believe in it or not, the way that it sort of dissects a human complexity is really accurate. It's like we do show up one way when we make your first impression, and we do show up another way when we're intimate with a lover, and another way when we're with our family, and another way when we're in an academic setting. Or the way we communicate can have a much different quality than the way that we're romantic, or the way that we have friendship can be very different from the way we have deep intimacy. And I was really confused by those kinds of contradictions before. And then this helped me understand, oh yeah, we are layered and complex. And it is useful to sort of have that tool of self-awareness to understand the ways in which we show up differently, and the ways in which we connect with people in different ways, and the ways we have discordance with people.
Okay, so you're saying that part of astrology is looking at the different ways that we express ourselves in different situations or with different people, right?
Yeah, it describes the layers of self, the layers of personality, the layers of connection, the way we connect. It even shows our life purpose. It shows, how we can show up in ways that will bring us success. It's very nuanced, yeah.
Okay, so let's focus on the personality part of it. What's one example of some, I don't know if you would call it a personality dimension or trait or something that astrology might talk about?
Yeah, well, it's the different planets represent different layers of self. And in terms of the personality, it's the personal planets. And so it's the sun and the moon are considered planets in astrology, just as a term. So the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars are the personal planets. And then the ascendant, or where the easternmost horizon fell at the moment of our first breath, it also describes a layer of personality. So those are what we look at first off when we look at a natal chart or the map of the planets at the moment of your first breath.
Okay, and a natal chart is a chart at the moment of birth.
Right, and it's just a map of the planets along the zodiac wheel, which is the circle representing the ecliptic or the apparent path of the sun from the perspective of Earth. It's divided into 30-degree increments, beginning at the original vernal equinox, which is 0 Aries, and going through the 12 signs. They don't line up exactly with the constellations, so when people try to debunk astrology, they don't actually understand how the zodiac works. It's always just been in the order of the constellations, but it never has correlated with the constellations exactly. And so Earth is in the middle, and then we look at the location of the planets and then the angles or the aspects they form to one another, and then which houses they're in, which is another way of dividing up the zodiac wheel.
Can someone not believe that let's say there's a skeptic who doesn't believe that astrology correlates to something out there with the planets at the moment of birth, but can they still get value from looking at personalities through the traits and the different sort of dimensions that you explain that astrology looks at people through?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's a funny question. Like I've read a lot of people's charts and a lot of non-believers' charts, because for a while, even before I was professional, my friends would be like, my boyfriend's a non-believer, read his chart. And we'd be at a party and I'd be like, you sure you want me to do this in front of everybody? And they'd be like, I don't care. And which I wouldn't do today, but because I'm professional, but I would do it then because it was funny. And so I'd start to read the person's chart. And it would be so revealing that they would get extremely embarrassed and make me stop, And so I've not had bad luck in sort of reading non-believers' charts and kind of getting them to come around to finding it useful or real or accurate. I've only had one person in my life, my ex, who
Of course.
yeah. And I read his chart and it was so precise and so accurate. And then he was dismissive of it. And then I wrote a book. And then so I was like, all right, I'm just going to read the book because this is not written about you. This is not me interpreting you, knowing you. This is objective. And I read, he had Moon in Cancer, and I read Moon in Cancer, and it described him in such specific detail to a T. It was like exactly him. And he was like, that's not me at all. And so I'm like, all right, at this point, you just have no self-awareness because I don't know what to tell you. And it's like uncanny how much this describes you.
How many readings do you think you've done? Ballpark.
Oh, countless. I have no idea the number. I have no idea the number.
Like 1,000?
I could go back and count. Yeah, probably around 1,000.
So what would be an example of something that you might do at that party that's so revealing to someone that it embarrasses them? Like, what's a specific example?
Like I could say something like, on the surface, you seem like really put together and, somewhat repressed and professional and with integrity. But when you really peel back the layers of the onion and you get to know who you are intimately, there is, more sensitivity and vulnerability and a sort of psychic ability to feel what other people are feeling. And then sexually, that's where the more experimental part of your nature comes out. And you might want to go into the depths of sexual experimentation and deep intimacy when on the surface you seem like, okay, I'm a really traditional person, Right. Or you might even be like bisexual or, have dabbled in, group sex or have those desires, which, it doesn't come across when you make a first impression, something like that. I mean, I just made that up on the fly, but there are other things
Right.
that are more revealing, like, oh, you have these tendencies towards escapism and addiction. And like there's part of you that it has trouble setting boundaries and taking care of yourself. But when you start, as you start to learn boundaries or as you start to master self-care, you feel as though your soul is like reaching its highest potential. And maybe someone might be embarrassed by the revealing that there's an addiction problem or escapism or something like that.
Okay. And so one common debunker approach would be that these descriptions can apply to many people, although the description that you just described with the person who outwardly looks reserved, but inwardly or sexually is much more expressive than you might imagine. Although that description could apply to many people who look reserved on the outside, because that might be a pattern, like sort of people make themselves look more reserved on the outside when inside they got all the stuff happening, right? Although that could be true. And you could just be doing a cold reading on someone. Oh, you look reserved, so this is what I'm going to say. I'm not saying you do that.
Right.
Clearly you don't. I can just tell intuitively that you're not that kind of person. But so what would you say to the debunker then that says, well, you've got to just be careful, these statements that can apply to a wide variety of people. What's your response?
I mean, I think that while that could apply to a wide variety of people, it's not a wide variety of people's main issue, And so when I read a person's chart, often people will cry, or there will be this like huge cathartic response because it feels like they're being seen or they're being validated and reflected back by a total stranger. And often what I'm told is I understand people better than they understand themselves, and I'm a virtual stranger, And so I actually don't waste my time like trying to talk to the debunkers, because I'm like, if it's not for you, it's not for you. I'm not here to convince you, But, I've read enough people's charts at this point to like know how cathartic it is and know how profound it is to be revealed by a stranger, and to understand that the map of a person's personality is reflected by the stars. I also see the chart as a tool for channeling, and so there's a choice that you have to make as an astrologer as to what to reveal and what to leave out, and so you can look at these archetypal potentials, and there's a choice, like which part am I going to reveal and which part am I going to leave out, and that has to do with just an intuitive connection, where to me, it feels like connecting to a person's higher self, and channeling through that. I mean, I feel like I channeled my book as well, which might sound out there for some people, but, that's part of what I'm doing. And when I write about the collective energies and the collective shifts, I'm channeling from the collective unconscious. So it's not just, and that said, I did study with Stephen Forrest, who's pretty much the world's leading authority on astrology. And I went to his house for a master class just in January of this year. And he gave us charts of unknown people, like famous people, but we had no idea who it was. And we had to read the chart in front of a group of other master astrologers, including Stephen Forrest, to be evaluated. And he wrote down lines from what we said. And at this point, there was no intuitive channeling. It was just merely reading the symbols. And he wrote down a bunch of lines that I said, and it turns out the person I was reading was Sally Ride, the first woman astronaut to go into space. And I said things that were extremely accurate about not just her being an astronaut, but her personal details of her life, and like apparently she was a lesbian, but she had to keep that private from the public sphere. And I saw in her chart that there was something that she had to hide in her personal life that she couldn't make public. I saw that she was a paradigm shifter, that she was doing something outside of the cultural norms to help progress humanity. I saw that she had a big group of intellectual peers, that she was on stage dialoguing with. I saw that she eventually became a professor, so there, and that teaching was a big part of her life eventually, and that's where she was moving toward. I saw that her mind was essential for her survival, that her, and being an astronaut, that's definitely the case, and that her studies were extremely important to her life and her intellectual and academic achievement. So that was pretty specific.
Right. And the more examples like that, where there's very specific things, like in her case, teaching was part of it. So if you were talking to someone who was not a teacher, that would be a pretty solid piece of evidence that something real is going on here, right? Let me see here. Here's a question. So at that meeting with Stephen Forrest, did you guys think of or try to see if the reading, like if your reading applied to Sally, the astronaut, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would it have also applied equally well to some other famous person that someone else had read?
Think about it for a second. Would anything I just said apply to you? It wouldn't apply to me.
Well, okay. So for me, part of it would. So teaching, I feel like this podcast in a certain ways is teaching people, and I've taught people in the past. What were some of the other things that you said about Sally that she had to?
Yeah, that she was like a public paradigm shifting person who defied cultural norms and helped progress humanity in a major way. That was Uranus on her ascendant.
I'd like to think of progressing humanity in a major way. Not quite there yet.
And that you've had some aspects of your personal life that you had to keep hidden and repressed from the public view.
But haven't we all?
No.
Don't we all have parts of our personal life that we have to repress a bit?
I'm an open book, and I actually have the opposite of Sally Ride in my chart. I have Uranus and Scorpio on my IC conjunct Lilith, and so there's this sort of, I've never hidden any part of my personal life, and I've always been incredibly audacious and open about who I am personally. And so when I look at my chart, it wouldn't apply to Sally Ride and vice versa. When you look at my chart, my key issues are revealed, right? I feel like an alien. That was like a theme of my life, and it's fully in my chart. I always felt like an outsider. I always felt like an alien, and almost to a neurotic degree. That's my moon in Aquarius on my IC. And I was meant to kind of go toward my North Node, which is my true life path, which is in Leo conjunct Mars in the 12th house. And so that is me moving away from a community that I served and finding my own path, right? And I didn't know how my life would unfold, right? But it turns out that I was part of a Buddhist lineage that became cult-like. And it turns out my teacher, who I was so devoted to, which is South Node 6th house, with my moon there, he was sexually assaulting people. And so I had to go from protecting him to protecting people from him. And I had to leave my whole ideological framework and community and forge my own path spiritually, right? And that's specifically revealed in my chart. And of course, I didn't understand that when I was younger, and the chart evolves, right? So those potentials showed up differently before. And as a child, it showed up as, I feel like an alien. I feel like an outsider. And one thing that makes me feel like I belong is being a dancer on stage. That's also Mars and Leo, right? And so those archetypes and that archetypal journey has continued to evolve throughout my life, but it's a very specific story, that shows up in very specific ways that still weave together these very specific archetypes. And so I don't know if that makes sense. But.
No, it makes perfect sense. And actually the point that you're an open book, and some people are open books, some people hide things more, like that's actually a valid sort of dimension of difference to compare different people. And to me, that part makes sense, how you could either validate or not validate what's going on, because some readings would apply more to some people, than others. So given that, then have there been, because I looked online, I couldn't see any, it seems like there should be a way to scientifically validate what astrology is about, or at least parts of it, right? Has there been any studies that
there have been lots of studies that have validated astrology, That's not my area of expertise, because as I said, I don't really care about convincing people. Like,
Right.
in fact, after being in a cult, I'm like, I really don't want to convince you of anything. Like, I'm like, go forth and find your own way. If this resonates, great. If it doesn't, go find something that does.
Right.
But yeah, there have been studies.
Can we talk about your experience in the cult?
Yeah, and it's controversial to call it a cult because other people are still part of that lineage and don't think of it as such. So I want to be sensitive to them, but at the same time, I firmly believe it was a cult. So. Yeah, it's a great experience to have had in this day and age, because I feel like it's the theme du jour.
Right. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, well, my specific experience was that I guess I was in my 20s. I was around 25, 24 maybe, when I first encountered this lineage, and I was really smitten with it for lots of reasons. One was I had this 85-year-old Buddhist Jewish therapist in New York named Bernie, who's an awful lot like the other Bernie. And he was like poetic and wild and inspiring. And he had been friends with like Allen Ginsberg and all these wild musicians, and who were all part of this Buddhist lineage and were students of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And I looked up to him, and he was so full of wisdom, and he blew my mind every time I met with him. And he was wild. He was outside of the box,
I'm sorry,
And
the 85-year-old
Buddhist
person
Jewish
okay,
therapist.
got it. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And all of my like creative, artistic weirdo friends in New York were going to see him at one point. And we were all just like having our minds blown by him because of the way that he talked to us and the way he like challenged us and the wisdom and stories he provided us. And so I was smitten with him. And then I began reading Pema Chodron's books, and she was a student of Chogyam Trungpa as well. And I started reading Chogyam Trungpa's books. And I mean, as a linguist, I studied writing in college. I've always been a writer and a linguist. And reading his books, I was blown away by his use of language. Like, he was born and raised in Tibet. When the Chinese invaded, he escaped across the Himalayas. He led 300 people using a divination mirror in the middle of winter. He suffered terrible, tragedies. And then he moved to England and studied in Oxford and mastered the English language and, started studying Western culture, because his goal was to implant Tibetan wisdom in the Western culture so that it wouldn't die as the Chinese invaded Tibet. And so he showed up in New York and said, "Show me your poets." And he was hailing a cab, and Allen Ginsberg was too. And they met and shared a cab, and, they became close friends. And then Allen became his devoted student. And that was a huge part of Allen Ginsberg's life and path and trajectory. And a lot of his poetry was inspired by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And so I was just blown away. I mean, I have chills even thinking about it. I was blown away by the teachings and by his writing and all of that. And I knew that he did drugs. I knew that he partied. I knew that he slept with students.
Wait, now, so you're not talking now about the 85-year-old Jewish.
No. This is his teacher, the 85-year-old's teacher
who's
had
from
died.
Tibet.
Yes, who died in 1987, but lived on in legend.
Okay.
And so I was like, and he started Shambhala Buddhism, which is the name of the lineage, and was the first person to bring Tibetan Buddhism to the United States.
Really? He was the first person to bring Tibetan Buddhism to the United States?
Chogyam Trungpa, yes.
Wow, okay. So he's a major figure in the...
Major figure, yeah. I mean, and, he was close with Ram Dass, and, they would teach together in Boulder, and, they were all part of that kind of crew in the 70s of, bringing this sort of Eastern mysticism to the hippies in the West. And he did it brilliantly. There's no doubt about it. And I wasn't put off by the fact that he was unconventional, because I was unconventional. And I wasn't put off by the fact that he partied, because I was like, I'm not moving to a monastery. I'm like 25 in New York. And I'm like, this is great. I can like be on the path and still party, because I'm not going to stop. And so it didn't bother me. And I I did a 30-day retreat, and it was so powerful. And the way that I felt afterwards was incredibly expanded, incredibly open to other people. It felt like being heartbroken and in love with everybody. I was like present with the turning of a leaf. I saw a family of geese cross the street, and I was like, oh my God, that's incredible. And it was just this feeling of elation, but also a grounded elation, and a feeling of deep magic and profundity and interconnection and purpose. And I was like, I want to feel this way all the time. And so the next year I went back and did the 30-day retreat again. And then I did a solitary retreat in the woods, no electricity or running water, just alone in a cabin doing my meditations. And that was like profound. And I was in Vermont, and I remember afterwards feeling so cracked open because I was suddenly able to kind of access things that seem out of the ordinary. And I thought maybe I was losing my mind. And because I could see energies and I knew things I couldn't possibly know, and I was feeling this deep connection to Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche that felt really vivid and real. And my retreat cabin was actually behind the place where he had been cremated. And I felt like I could connect with his soul. And I was like, all right, either I've really cracked something open or I've lost my mind. And so I went to the head Acharya, who's the head teacher who was living there. And I said, I think I've lost my mind. I feel very cracked open, and I'm perceiving things, that, oops, did you freeze?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
There you're back. Okay. So I'm perceiving things outside of the ordinary. And I was like, maybe I should go to the mental institution. He's like, well, this is the mental institution. This is a mental institution. And I was like, oh, you're right. And he's like, you need to ground. You need like meat and potatoes. Like you just, you like saw the sun and you got cracked open, but like just come back to earth. And he was right. And I ended up working in the garden there and really grounding. And I applied to work in the garden and did for a while. And then I applied for a job to work in the programs department because I was like, I couldn't get enough of it. I wanted to keep learning and keep immersing myself. And a lot of it was like profound and beautiful and real. I was like meeting Qigong masters from China and, Tibetan royalty, and who were these profound teachers of emptiness. And I was really, learning so much.
But you were meeting them in person, not in
person
form. Okay.
In person.
Well, let me ask you quickly, what was something that you said you knew things that you shouldn't know? Were you seeing the future? Were you seeing spirits, or what are we talking about?
I don't want to freak people out, but I had a dream, for example. This is one of many examples, but I had a dream, and in the dream, basically there are details you don't need to know, but Chogyam Trungpa was there, and I was struggling with jealousy, and he looked me in the eyes like he loved me, and I've never felt so loved or so connected in my entire life. And then I saw him look at everyone the exact same way. And I realized that just because he connected with other people in that way, that didn't diminish the love and connection that we shared. And my jealousy immediately healed. And then we were saying goodbye. And he was like, take these texts and put them in your bag. Like, the Chinese are coming. And we were in Chinatown in New York, because that's where I used to live. So that was my reference point for China. And so I took the books, and then I got captured by the Chinese, and he got into a Mercedes, like a navy blue Mercedes from the 80s. And he started to drive away. And I yelled out to him, I love you. And he yelled back, I love you too. And I said, will I see you again? And he said, you'll see me again and again. And he drove away. And the next morning I told a bunch of his students about that dream, and they started crying. And they were like, he used to drive that car, and he used to say to us every time he left, I'll see you again and again. I had no idea of those things.
Right.
So that was really meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds, one potential explanation is you were tapping into universal mind that has all knowledge, and you were somehow getting access to that through your dreams. Cool.
Yeah.
Continue on, because I want to get to the point where this turns into a cult.
Okay. Okay, long story short, his son is now the head of the lineage, and I was really devoted to him, and he's really wonderful in many ways. But it turns out, because of the way he was raised in this sort of 70s scene of like orgies and drugs, and, I think he developed some sexual trauma, and it turns out Chogyam Trungpa had been molested as a child in the monasteries in Tibet, and he held sexual trauma, and he had PTSD from losing all these people in Tibet, that even though he was a master of emptiness, he hadn't fully addressed the human trauma, and nor had his son. And so I think even though people were accessing real profundity and emptiness through these very real practices, there were these feminine aspects of the path that weren't being addressed, which in my mind are healing and love. And so we were dealing with emptiness and wisdom very, very profoundly, but we weren't addressing healing, and we weren't focusing on love. And so a lot of people within the community were practicing sexual harm, and the Children of God cult dismantled in the 70s, and many of them came into Shambhala. So there was a history of child molestation and among the kids who grew up in Shambhala that was never properly addressed. And then it turns out my teacher had sexually assaulted people as well. And there was this vow that we had taken to him to never speak against him, to never speak poorly of him, to never speak poorly of other people who had taken the same vow. We were called tantrikas and sadhakas, like we were the senior practitioners within this lineage. And there were very few young people. I was one of the few young people who got to that place of like being senior practitioners. And it was very special to have gotten there. And I devoted a lot of my life to it for a good portion, over 10 years, I would say. And so it was when I realized what had happened, when I realized he had sexually assaulted my friend, it was a huge effort to sort of deprogram from that devotion to the place of stepping out of protecting him to stepping into protecting others from him. And I realized that there was a cult conditioning embedded in me that I had to undo. To be able to have the courage to speak out. And it wasn't easy. And I had to really understand that, even the Buddha said, use this raft to cross the shore, but once you get to the shore, lose the raft,
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that there is a danger in religiosity. There's a danger in becoming too religious. And that was never the point. It was never the point to be religious. It was like scrubbing an oil stain with oil-based soap, where it's like, here are the stories that you've been inherited from your culture, and these stories are just meant to help you dislodge from those stories. But then when you cling to the new stories, you've missed the point, And so in some ways it was the perfect hero's journey of like having to turn against your teacher and find your own path. And I don't regret any of it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. If I could ask a follow-up question, you don't have to answer this or not. But so in a situation like that, if a teacher has even consensual sexual relations with a student, is that considered sexual assault? Is that what we're referring to?
It was more than that.
Okay.
Even that is questionable because there is a power imbalance, but I wouldn't be upset if it was just that. Or I would be like, let's question this, like seriously question this and scrutinize this. But I wouldn't be like, this is a fucking cult,
Right.
And so what I'm talking about was more, he would drink and, really cross the line of what's okay.
Right. Okay. I think I find that so interesting that you guys were required or encouraged, or part of the process was to take a vow not to talk negatively about the teachers. That seems...
Yeah, I mean, it's an ancient vow. It's not a vow that was invented by Shambhala. It's like the ancient Tibetan Buddhist vow where when you become what's called a Vajrayana Buddhist or a Tantrika. It's like the tantric practices of esoteric Buddhism. You devote yourself to a teacher, and the teacher becomes the physical representation of the Buddha, and a mirror of your own enlightened mind, your own enlightened potential. Now, in that act of devotion, it's sort of like a surrender. It's like there's a powerful act of surrender and humility that's quite helpful on the path. But the person who receives that devotion and surrender has to always remind you that he or she is only there for you to use on your path to awakening. As soon as there's ego involved, money involved, power involved, it gets really murky. And I don't trust personally at this point in my life that any person is mature enough to handle that, or that kind of relationship could ever really be appropriate. I listened to like Ram Dass talk about his teacher, and it feels different to me than that. It was like there was nothing that teacher wanted from Ram Dass. And that feels more appropriate to me, right? So I understand his devotion to his teacher. It was a different dynamic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, man. I would imagine it would be hard for just about anybody to be in a situation like that and to not be tempted to abuse the power.
Well, it's hard for men, especially.
Especially, yeah, sure, right.
Especially when there's like a female devoting herself to you. I think that there's a general masculine immaturity in our world right now. And maybe if that shifts, I still don't think it's appropriate, but like it definitely not at this point.
Do you feel there's also a feminine immaturity in the world at this point?
But from talking to people every day in my work, what I've noticed is in general, there's a much higher maturation among females than males at this point. But yeah, everyone can be immature, like period. We're all humans. But in terms of like empathy and pure intention and self-awareness, there's what I've noticed in general is that there's a higher maturation among females right now.
Yeah, I would imagine, isn't it? I mean, generally true that, well, we could go down a rabbit hole here. I don't want to get too off track. Thank you for sharing that story though, about the cult. That was fascinating. And one of the things that I've learned or a belief I've come to is if, you said you were smitten with the older meditation Jewish teacher, so, charismatic and everything. So many times charisma is a warning sign. Narcissists tend to be very charismatic, right? And most people aren't that charismatic, maybe there may be a little bit, but not much. But if there's someone who's really charismatic, it's like, oh, wait a second, potential red flag. Let's see what's going on here a little bit. Let's get back to astrology a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Can you describe, like for the person out there who doesn't know much about astrology, is there something you haven't described yet that would be like something that would really help them to understand kind of the structure of astrology?
Well, I wrote a book called The Stars Within You, A Modern Guide to Astrology. And it was basically the introduction to astrology I always wished existed when I was studying astrology, that never existed. And I introduce it, the introduction I think gives a really good layout. I go into the history of it. I go into the basic components of what it is and how it's useful. And then I break down, the different ingredients of how to read a chart. And, the signs, the planets, aspects, and the houses are the basic ingredients.
And so it's based on the day you were born and the location you were born, right?
Yeah, the day, the time, and the location.
Okay. So then, I know you're not here to convince anyone of anything. Any response to the observation then? So I was born 3 a.m. at a certain hospital here in Southern California. Wouldn't the dozen or so babies that were also born immediately right after or close there be surprisingly, strikingly similar to me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's funny. I just talked to a client this morning who's a twin, and I know her twin sister as well. And it's funny because she's like, we are so different. Like, she's Icelandic, they're Icelandic, and she's like, we are so different. Like, how I really want to know, like, I do tutoring with her, and the next time we meet, we're going to talk about how the differences show up in the chart. And the thing that's so funny is she's like telling me they're so different, but they're actually so similar, you know.
Really?
But anyway, those potentials can show up in different ways, and free will is a big part of that. Of course, genetics can be part of that, because twins can have different genes if they're not identical. And different people born at the same time have different genes, different upbringings. And so the coloring of those potentials can be different, right? I always say too, like, if two twins have rebelliousness in their charts, like let's say two twins have Aquarius moons or strong Uranus in their charts, part of how they develop and identify themselves is going to be in rebellion to one another. So it's like, okay, as you develop, this person's going to work really hard at distinguishing themselves from the other twin. Right. And so that's going to shape who they become, for example. But, if you look at anyone's chart, like my chart, I'm a Virgo rising, Aquarius moon. I actually have a lot of friends who are also Virgo suns, Aquarius moons. Now, we're all different. We all do different things. But they are we're weirdly similar too. Like, I'm an astrologer now, right? So I'm very detailed and precise, which is Virgo. And then I'm kind of cosmic. I call us the cosmic nerds, right? So I'm always thinking about the bigger picture and humanity, and, and then going into the minutia and then finding the collective, overarching theme, and then, if you think about the illustrator of my book is a Virgo Aquarius, he does really precise drawings, like very talented, but he draws sort of cosmic material or alien-like material. So similar energies. Or Kimball Musk, is a Virgo Aquarius, right? And so he's working on creating these gardens for different communities to like help with like food deserts and things like that. And so he's very organized and precise and into Virgo and health related things, but he's thinking about humanity, and progress, and how do we progress humanity, and how can I contribute to these various communities in meaningful ways, right? How can I be of service, Virgo?
Right. And so it's not enough to say someone's Virgo, right? Because I guess there is a potential for a lot of variability, because that's, 28 days or whatever. It depends on the specific day that you were born and the time and the location.
And the location.
Seems complicated.
It is. It's a very complicated. It's like no joke. I always say it's like you have to know geometry. You have to know stars. You have to know archetypes. You have to know storytelling. You have to be able to have this kind of improvisational skill of like weaving together the different archetypes and the different, and understand symbology, and then layer everything together in a cohesive way. I mean, I think of myself as like a cosmic storyteller.
How the hell did you get good at this? How much of it is just frickin' just intuitive? You've got the gift or the ability to.
I mean, I weirdly have the gift. It just feels like it calls on everything I'm good at. Like, as soon as I started reading charts, I was good at it. And I didn't grow up that way. I told you I grew up in conservative Texas with like capitalistic parents and whatever. And,
Those damn capitalists.
Yeah. I mean, sort of, I believe that. And I was like, not that way. But then as soon as I saw an astrology chart, it wasn't in my vocabulary to think this, but I was like, this is an energy map. And I intuitively understood the shapes and the lines and the angles I was seeing, and it intuitively matched the person I knew. I was like, this makes sense. And then as I started reading the chart, it just came really naturally to me. I didn't believe in past lives at the time, but I was like, oh, I've done this in past lives. It was just that kind of intuitive hit of like, I already know how to do this. And so I was pretty good at it right off the bat, but then I just kept going. And I am obsessive with whatever I'm interested in. Like I feel like anything I would have been interested in, I would have gone all the way with, because I'm just like that. And I became obsessed with astrology pretty quickly.
So you mentioned free will, and I think a lot of people out there that are sort of like astrology, because I want to have free will, and astrology suggests everything is determined. So if you could talk on, right, exactly. So if you could speak to that, yeah.
Yeah, no, it definitely doesn't. And like 99.9% of modern day astrologers agree. I mean, if anyone doesn't agree that we have free will and they're an astrologer, I would say they're a hack, or they've like misunderstood something. But that is something that we emphasize as professional astrologers, free will. And what it is a karmic guide, a karmic map of our potentials. What we do with those potentials is entirely up to us. A good example of that is like Charles Manson's chart. The Manson family, who was the cult leader who orchestrated the murder of Sharon Tate, etc. And he has Pluto, I believe, on his IC. And Pluto is trauma, death and rebirth, abuse, and the IC is the family and the mother line. And so and it's obsession. So there was this deep trauma with his mother and the death of his mother. I think believed his mother died when he was quite young, and he ended up going from foster family to foster family. And he was obsessed with the notion of family, the Manson family, and Pluto is the shadow. Pluto is the underworld. It's our unprocessed material that needs processing so that we can be reborn. We can rise like the phoenix from the destruction of our traumas, right? And he had this incredible charisma in his chart, this incredible creativity and charisma and this obsession with family. He could have done something amazing with that. Right? He could have gone into deep therapy and healed his deep mother wound and healed the wound of not having a family. And he could have created this creative family and this community in a way that was constructive rather than destructive, right? But because he didn't choose that potential, he kind of went into the neurotic potential or fell into the neurotic potential. He was still clearly charismatic, wildly creative, and obsessed with family, but he went into the neurosis of that potential.
Interesting. And so we have potentials, and yet we also have free will that can shape how that potential manifests.
Exactly. Like when someone has a lot of 12th house planets, I'm like, okay, you can either be a serial killer or the Dalai Lama, because often when we have a lot of unconscious material to work with in this lifetime, we either become conscious of it through the act of meditation, right? And then become these really realized people, or we fall prey to acting out incredibly unconsciously,
Do you still meditate these days, right?
Yeah, I do.
Can you share just a little bit about your current meditation practice, if you think there's any value in sharing that?
I guess so, yeah.
So when I talk to people who meditate, it's like so many people talk about meditation. Yeah, I meditate, but there's so many different ways to meditate. So sometimes I feel like there's some value in kind of figuring out what people are doing.
That makes sense. I like that. Yeah, well, basic shamatha meditation is what we first learn, which is sitting up straight, feeling the strength of our spines, the softness of our hearts, and then returning to the breath. So when we start to write stories about whatever thoughts or feelings are arising, we say, oh, thinking, return to the breath. So we're training the mind to not follow the storylines and just to stay with the direct phenomena that's rising. And so I've done that enough where I'm pretty freaking good at it by now. I've done that a lot. So I definitely do basic shamatha practice every day. And then I also, it was really like I let go of a lot of my practices because they were connected to my teacher, because I was doing these sort of esoteric practices that were all sort of connected to him, and I didn't want to do them anymore. And so I recently started doing a Padmasambhava practice, which is an ancient practice that's traditional Tibetan Buddhism that's not connected to any teacher, not connected to my specific lineage. And it's a song, like you sing the song kind of invoking the energy of Padmasambhava. And I really love that singing, because it very much puts me in my body, and it's a way of kind of interrupting your thought stream. You know, you have to stay present with the song and with the seed syllables that you're singing and the words and the feelings. And so I do that, basic shamatha and Padmasambhava. And then I practice the dedication of merit frequently, but especially after my practices, where I dedicate the merit of my practice to the benefit of all beings.
Right. Is there any place online, if someone wanted to learn that song or a similar song, is there any place online they could actually learn that?
No, you have to receive the empowerment. It's like a lineage thing. So, I mean, I don't know how much I believe in that, but that's, I mean, I do on some level believe in that, because you receive what's called a transmission from a teacher who's received it from the lineage holder who came before. And there is this energetic transmission that occurs where you're empowered to sort of connect to the energies of the ancestral lineage through the person handing it down. So, I mean, I laugh at some of it, but some of it I'm like, no, that makes sense, you know? Mm-hmm. So you have to receive the empowerment to sing in. So.
And even without having that specific song or the transmission, I've been finding lately in my own practice that simply at the end of my practice, if I dedicate it, like the merit of it, to the betterment of all beings, or some other sort of altruistic, perhaps, intention, and I just kind of say that out loud and maybe repeat it or say it very slowly and just kind of try to feel it, mm-hmm. It feels good.
Yeah, I agree. And it's that kind of letting go of the, like, we called it the me plan in my lineage, but I like that. It's like letting go of the me plan, of the capitalistic me plan. You know, and our society has trained us to be individualistic and look out for ourselves, and just to focus on succeeding and achievement and success, which is the me plan. But if it's like, oh, I want to succeed so I can be a benefit to all beings, it changes our priorities and our focus in a really beautiful way that softens our hearts and makes life easier, ironically.
Yeah, and I like to share, Tony Robbins has taken Abraham Maslow's different human needs, and in Tony's explanation of it, which I actually like, the top two needs, which are growth needs, which are beyond the base needs. The top two needs, it's personal development, developing ourselves, but then it's contribution. So the idea is really to feel that fulfillment, deep fulfillment, we need to be developing ourselves on one hand and also contributing to people besides ourselves. You have to have both. If it's just developing yourself, well, then you're just being selfish, and it's all about the ego then.
Absolutely. And that we're moving into the Aquarian age right now, according to astrology. So this was meant to be the big year where we moved from one age in humanity to the next. And for years before 2020, I was like, watch out, 2020, all reality as we know it is going to change. And we're going into this more egalitarian age now. And the winter solstice of this year is the big kickoff date, where basically people who are thinking about the betterment of others and the health of other humans and animals and the earth are going to succeed more so than those who are, being greedy at the expense of others. So take it or leave it, believe it or not. That's what's happening according to astrology.
So Juliana, I want to thank you so much for your time. And if people want to learn more about astrology, I would imagine you would direct them to your book, right?
Yeah, my book is The Stars Within You, A Modern Guide to Astrology by Juliana McCarthy. That's me. And I have a website and an Instagram called Ethereal Culture. And if you're interested in my writings, I write about the new moon and the full moon and the astrology of every month, like clockwork. So, you know, you can follow me there, and I share sort of spiritual inspiration relevant to the shifting energies. And yeah.
And your book is available on Amazon.
Yeah, available everywhere pretty much.
And can you spell out the Instagram account?
Yeah, ETHEREAL culture, CULTURE.
Perfect.
Yeah. Oh, and I wanted to mention, like, if you want a practice that you actually can access without a transmission, I really love the app 10% Happier. It's like all my favorite Buddhist teachers are on there, and I downloaded it recently, and I was like, this is awesome. So I've been doing that. I've been listening to talks on there, and I've been really getting a lot out of it.
Yeah, you know, it's funny you say that, because that is my favorite meditation app as well.
Oh,
And
cool.
and I've tried like probably 3 or 4 of the major ones, but for me, 10% Happier, just the format of seeing the video of people sharing the teaching and then followed by the guided meditation. I love that. I love that there's so many different courses to choose from. Yeah, it's a wonderful app. So definitely.
It's so good. Yeah. And like the best of the Buddhist teachers.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, my favorites.
What's one of your favorites?
Well, I love Angel Kyoto Williams. She's on there. I love Jack Kornfield. He's on there.
Mm-hmm.
And who else? I have to jog my memory, but I'm like blanking, and I know these people's names, but anyway, just look, because like everyone on there I'm obsessed with.
Awesome. Well, Juliana, thanks again for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.